Bienvenidos a todos y a todas a la 15ª edición del Congreso sobre Bilingüismo de CETAM. Estamos muy contentos de poder organizar este año, sobre todo, el Congreso, porque el año pasado nos quedamos justo a las puertas de poder celebrarlo. Será una versión diferente este año, sin lugar a dudas, pero por lo menos tenemos un espacio para juntarnos y para hablar sobre educación y lo bien que lo estáis haciendo todos vosotros todos los días. Muchos nos habéis dicho que estabais contentos con poder asistir, aunque sea un congreso virtual, y la verdad que hemos batido récord, como ha dicho Fernando antes, de inscritos, lo cual nos confirma que tenéis ganas de seguir aprendiendo y mejorando en el campo de la educación bilingüe. Echaremos en falta las conexiones personales, que siempre nos agradan en los congresos, pero eso hace que el año que viene aprovecharemos aún más la experiencia. Que empiece el congreso. Y cambio al inglés para presentar al primer ponente. It's an honor and a privilege to start this conference off with such a special guest speaker. Peter Mejisto is renowned in the bilingual education world, having worked with all levels of education from pre-primary through the university levels, and throughout the world, both in public and the private sectors. Peter's work focuses on supporting teachers, administrators, and government officials who are involved in education, be it through the books he's written or the research projects that he's involved in. All of this offers him a unique, holistic perspective on learning processes. He's familiar with different types of bilingual programs, and his main areas of research incorporate positive educational practices into bilingual education. And as he argues for programs where both languages support one another and combine to make up one program that's composed of two languages in each school. He's prepared a special talk for us today, and I'm sure we're all going to learn a great deal from him. I want everyone to know that you can ask any question that you have in the chat, and at the end of each session, we will ask whoever's speaking to answer the questions that people have. Para lo que no os entendéis bien el inglés, por favor, poned todas las preguntas que tengáis en el chat, los recopilaremos y al final de cada sesión preguntaremos al ponente para que responda. So Peter, whenever you're ready, please feel free to begin. Thank you.
Okay, perfecto.
So thank you very much for that introduction, Sarah, that generous introduction. Hola, it's a delight to be with you here today for this conference. And welcome, and we're going to be looking at high performance and well-being in collaborative bilingual education. And I'm going to share just a little bit about my own experience and some ideas from that before I go into the talk. So I'm coming to you from Estonia. The snow has melted, but it's still cold. I'm coming to you from the medieval city of Tallinn, and in Estonia, we've established a national bilingual program that's been running for 20 years very effectively. But I've also spent a good portion of the last 12 years in London. I'm associated with University College London Institute of Education. My English comes from Canada, where I've also had experience with bilingual education. I've also lived in the United States, which is an interesting place from the perspective of bilingual education. There are states such as Utah that very effectively support bilingual programming, and other places which actually try to prevent bilingual education from expanding. Malaysia, another example where there's been a bilingual program, it was canceled, now it's being brought back to life. France, Switzerland, that is Kazakhstan, where I've had the privilege of working on trilingual education, establishing actually the Nazarbayev intellectual schools, and the government is establishing a network of trilingual schools, and I've been able to work with that network along with Cambridge University and many other universities. I've also had the privilege of working for government, and if I've learned one thing in education, it's listen to the teachers, listen to the school directors. They need to implement policy. The policy must make sense. Vietnam, Mexico, where I've had the privilege of working with the University of Guadalajara for several years, implementing bilingual programming, and Finland as well. Bilingual programs can be found all over the world, and although bilingual education is context dependent, there are some factors that apply that are success factors that we can see across the world, and those are things I'm going to try and touch on today. So what are my intended primary outcomes for this session? I hope that you'll have an overview of what teachers and students are saying globally about the current context, because bilingual education, which is more demanding than standard education, has to also operate effectively in the COVID context. Some particularly high impact teaching and learning strategies I hope to share with you. And in particular, I'd like to look at the role of language learning outcomes, the role and content outcomes, because they play a particular role in bilingual education. This will be the structure for the talk. First, we're going to look at how people think. And the reason for this is I'm going to ask you to think outside of the box. And unfortunately, it's not easy for people in general to think outside of the box. But once we know how people think, perhaps it's a little easier to push our thinking out of those common patterns. Then I'd like to talk about the current COVID context, but take a perspective of students from across the world who've been working through the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Then talk about social and emotional skills, which have already been mentioned, but they play a particularly important role in this context and normally in learning, and in particular in bilingual education. Then I'm going to try to talk about the highest impact influences on learning, because almost everything we do works. The question is, are we using some of the things that work exceptionally well? And then we'll come to content and language learning outcomes if we can stay in the time frame. So how do people think? There's a neurologist out of California who says, imagine this image. And this image is an analogy for how people think. Imagine rain falling onto a hillside. First, the water flows in any direction, down the path of least resistance. Little creeks come together to form rivers, small rivers form bigger rivers, and finally, when a mighty river digs out, carves out its riverbed, it's very difficult to make it change course. And that's a little bit like our thinking patterns. Once they have developed, it's very difficult for us to think outside of them. The brain is plastic. We can change our thinking. It's just not very easy to do. Hart and others who looked at several studies, this is a meta-study, on how people make decisions and seek out information. They found that people are approximately twice as likely to seek out information that reinforces their existing point of view. That means it's very difficult to even hear new information and to give new information that is outside of our patterns of thought the time and due consideration sometimes it would deserve. But let's go to the current context. I'd like to talk about the student perspective. And as I said, this is being drawn from across the world, from students who have been working through the OECD's Future of Education and Skills 2030. Students are talking about the challenge of staying motivated in this context. So if that's their challenge, it's our challenge as teachers. They're saying they're finding it difficult to continue to believe in themselves. They're worried about the risk for a significant percentage of students of dropping out. So they're not just talking about themselves, they're talking about other students. They're worried about safety because school used to provide safety, and some children, some young people are finding themselves in difficult home situations. They're also saying cyberbullying is an issue, and this is something that really requires being addressed, surveyed to find out how safe students are feeling. They're worried about their learning. They're worried about access. Those that have computer access, because do families have enough computers? Is the connection strong enough? And what about those students who don't have a computer for every person in the family? And school is much more than just learning for the examination. Hopefully it's much, much more, but it's also relationships, and they're missing the relationships, and they're worried about examinations, how they will cope on those. But all of these issues are tied to equity and student well-being, making sure that all students have a fair shake. And the OECD has now put together a document, and I can add that later on, about strategies other nations are using to ensure that there is equity and well-being during COVID. But teachers are also with the students. They interact as a kind of a holistic system. And teachers are talking about their workload, how excessive it is, how difficult it is for them. They're worried about their own learning. Is it fast enough to cope in this situation? They're worried about their own relationships among other teachers, with other teachers, and with students in this context. And students have started to talk more in this forum about harmful words and actions to make these relationships concrete, and a need to really think about what damage those can cause. And both teachers and students are talking about the effect of no words, not being seen, not being on the radar, not existing for someone else as being a major danger. And students said as a counterweight, there are some magic words and actions by teachers. And the key message was always, I believe in you. If one could get across that feeling, that really helps students continue to move on. But of course, motivation, staying motivated, teachers themselves, and continuing to motivate students was a challenge. But teachers shouldn't be left alone either. Parents, social partners, policymakers, teacher trainers, school leaders, others, none of this can be outsourced. In a sense, we're all responsible. But I'd like to come back to this concept of I believe in you and get a little more concrete about what students have said. So how to build motivation and self-confidence? It's not simply by saying, go on, go, 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 raw, I believe in you, but it's I believe in you through concrete steps, by taking the time to give regular, timely feedback, clear criteria and goals, because students were protesting against busy work, not understanding why some work was being given. They wanted to know the goals, they wanted the criteria, and they wanted to see and experience progress. So put in other ways, step-by-step achievement, success is what builds confidence. But you can't do that without regular, timely feedback, clear goals and criteria, and experiencing progress. And students have also said that they've recognized teachers are in a very difficult position. But here are some of the things they said have been most important to them: one-on-one meetings, emotional and other supports, structure, and just help in helping them to stay on track. Now, I'd like to come back to this idea of emotions because they keep coming through this whole discussion in COVID. So let's talk about, if I may, social skills and emotional skills. All those aspects of cognition, thinking that are most heavily recruited in education. That is learning, attention, staying focused on what we need to do, memory, recalling what we're learning, decision-making, motivation, and social functioning. All of those aspects of thinking are subsumed, are affected by emotions and are actually subsumed within emotions. We cannot separate them from emotions. So they're central to learning. If they can't be separated from emotions, how are we helping students to self-regulate? So what are social and emotional skills? Briefly, there's self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. Now, if we teach one of those skills, what are the benefits? An 11% increase in student achievement on examinations or tests. So this doesn't simply come from one study. These are two meta-studies. The first one looked at over 270,000 students from primary through to secondary. And the other one looked at some 70 studies. So this is a very large data set. And both of them found the same thing. So if we teach some of these skills, look at the increase. It takes a lot to get an 11% increase in student achievement. Interestingly enough, a 30-year study looking at following students found they also had improved health, physical health 30 years later, less substance dependence, meaning alcohol, cigarettes, drugs, better personal finances, and less criminal offending. So there's a lot to be gained for society and individuals by teaching social and emotional skills. So the brain and the heart, in a sense, go together, is one of the key points that I'm trying to get across. Now, you may say, hey, wait up, in the beginning, you said the brain isn't very plastic. Well, here's some good news. Here's my friend, the neuron. Sorry to the science teachers here. It's my liberal interpretation of what a neuron looks like. This neuron is located in the prefrontal cortex. That is the executive control area of the brain. It's sort of the command and control center. And it is between 10 to 23 years old. And notice what's happening to that neuron. Young people have a second burst of plasticity in that area of the brain, which means they're more flexible and they can generate a considerable number of new neurons, and they can make connections between the prefrontal cortex, which is all about self-regulation, and other parts of the brain. So young people are really very capable of changing their thinking and their ways. So why are social emotional skills doubly important in bilingual education? Well, let's start from this simple fact. The use of a second language by a non-fluent speaker slows down the processing of new information. It reduces the capacity of working memory to process new content. Now, this does not mean students in bilingual education cannot learn as much. It just means they need more scaffolding, more support. Things need to be broken into smaller pieces. They need particular language support. So if everything we learn, this is a model of how we move information into long-term memory through working memory. Everything must go through working memory. And there are two parts to it we're going to talk about right now, that's short-term memory and active. And that's how we get into long-term memory. So let's look first at the short term. It's 7 digits, and you see when I take it away, how hard it is to recall all of that. So 2 chunks of new information or 1 to 3 concepts we can hold in our working memory for 20 seconds. In bilingual education, this means we need to be particularly careful to offer scaffolding, not to waste time. Always instructions in writing, so we leave the brain free to concentrate on what it needs to. But at the same time, students need to, while they're trying to absorb and use those things in working memory, see, once again, I'm making it very difficult to hold on to something like that. Let me leave it on the screen. A student needs to be making decisions about how to structure and process new information. They have to be making connections to what's already in their head. All that has to happen in 20 seconds. Now, here's the problem. That is challenging enough. But in fact, there's also affect. So working memory is actually also all that input has to get through the emotion, we have to hold on to things in the short term. We have to decide how we're going to use this information before it will get into long-term memory. And emotions can impair or support cognition. So anxiety has a detrimental effect on working memory performance. It requires additional attentional resources. So that's in particular one of the reasons you often hear, and I'm sure so many of you do, try to create a safe environment where students aren't afraid to experiment with language and make mistakes, because mistakes is how we learn. So how are social and emotional skills taught? One option is for you to go to the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, great website, open access. Key for us always is to have the language. And I'm not even sure, having studied part of my life through English, that anyone taught me the word bulldozed perhaps humiliated, but heartbroken, fascinated, victimized, etc. All of this language is essential to have a deep conversation about emotions. So students would need scaffolding. They'd need some kind of a sheet where some of this language is presented in an organized way under categories, because we remember things better when they're in categories. Or here are some negative ones, such as judgmental, stern, frowning, attacked, serious, tactless, etc. There's also a Yale ruler for emotional literacy. It consists of recognizing emotions in self and others, understanding the causes and consequences of emotions, labeling emotions correctly, expressing emotions appropriately, and regulating emotions effectively. So with a group of children 10 years old, I've seen this model used where children came in from the playground and several were very upset about what happened on the playground. The teacher listened and everybody recognized what the emotions were. Then there was a discussion to understand the causes of the emotions and the resulting consequences of yelling at someone or getting really angry at someone. Then they relabeled the emotions. Then they worked at how to express these emotions in a more positive way. And quite frankly, by then they had learned to regulate their emotions effectively and they could move on with learning. Yale also has a mood meter. And if you look at the y-axis, it's low energy on the left-hand side at the bottom and high energy at the top. And on the x-axis, we're feeling unpleasant. They're on the left-hand side and really pleasant on the other side. So students use this, young students to quite old students, and it focuses on self-awareness and self-regulation. Students first learn about facial expressions, body language, vocal tones, physiology. Students can do some of this investigation themselves, of course. And all emotions are validated. If someone is feeling some way, well, it just is what they're feeling. It needs to be accepted. But that doesn't mean they can behave any way they want. And when appropriate, we look for ways about how to move on. Perhaps a really here we see some examples of how it's been used. Students have put adjectives onto that mood meter. Here's an example from primary. I feel mad, I got in a fight, misspelled, with a friend, misspelled, but that doesn't matter. Many ways to use these tools. Open access, give it a shot, would be my suggestion. Or we can teach mindsets, fixed versus growth mindsets. This comes from Carol Dweck, 2010, and further on. Lots of videos available on this and books. And it's about the idea of having a fixed mindset, that we cannot do it, or to have a more growth mindset, which says we can do it. And this is something that is very thoroughly researched. It is not simply something that is philosophical. So this having a growth mindset is particularly important for several reasons. Teaching students to have a growth mindset raises their achievement, as simple as that. This is especially important for those students who are laboring under a negative stereotype about their abilities. So socioeconomically, kids from socioeconomically deprived backgrounds, in particular, it's important to use this with them. They can take better control of their lives. Growth mindset students outperform fixed mindset students. And here's the shock. It gets worse as they get older. The gap grows over the years. And students of growth mindset teachers outperform students of fixed mindset teachers. So we need to reflect on our own mindset. If we have a fixed mindset that a student can't achieve, they're not going to achieve. If we believe they will, they're much more likely to. So teaching mindsets, well, you can watch and discuss a video about how the brain changes when we learn. So students see it's kind of like a muscle that can develop. Students analyze their own mindsets. And if you Google this, I think you'll find some typical questions that can be used to figure out your mindset. Or you can teach learning skills, how to learn. And discussing fixed mindset sentences when you hear them in a classroom. Oh, I'm not good at maths. And setting up a plan forward. I wasn't good at maths in school. My brother sat me down and he had a growth mindset and he overcame my fixed mindset about mathematics. And I've managed to graduate several times cum laude after, but not without the help of my brother to change my mindset. Teaching self-regulation and cooperation skills. So those are just some of the strategies. Mindsets, definitely worth taking a look at if you are not familiar with the concept. Has a profound influence on learning. One quick self-management strategy. Takes little time, has a really big impact. Step one, have students take 2 minutes at the end of a class to write down how they will prepare for next week's test, or steps they will take to write the essay, the plan. They hand this in hard copy, or you can use an electronic platform. And then, we're not moving, there. And the next day, students divide the data, their answers, into high impact and low impact strategies. Here's an example. Imagine your students have said things like this. I'll test myself, I'll highlight important points, or I'll write out questions I think the teacher will ask. I'll work in a group to write answers and to possible questions. And then the students work to try and decide which ones are high impact or low impact. Here's the answer. We have a lot of research on this, reviewing notes and highlighting important points. Okay, not the worst strategy in the world. It's better. It certainly is a strategy, but it's a low impact strategy versus testing myself, writing answers to possible questions, writing out questions I think the teacher will ask, working in a group to write out answers. So why is this high impact? It provides feedback to students on their thinking really quickly, doesn't take much time. It gives ideas on how to better prepare, and it supports students in building learning skills, managing their own learning. Let's go to some more research findings. But, you know, we've been probably sitting for a long time. If I could suggest we just stand for a moment. And the reason I say that is the body aids, expresses, and extends thinking. If we sit too long, we simply don't think as well. So could we take a minute to stand and just stretch in any direction you want, move a little, get the body moving again. And you know, the research says that any teacher who does this, mathematics, history, geography, they might think you're a little strange the first time, but in the long run, they have a more positive impression. No study has ever found that students have learned less if you do this, and you can let the students lead the activities in the future. This wasn't really an activity, but just another idea. So we're looking at ideas that come from John Hattie. He's written an incredible number of books. This is just a few of them. And he synthesized with his team over 1,200 meta-studies, so studies of studies. This includes over 80,000 research articles, and it touches on more than 200 million students. It's very difficult to ignore. It doesn't mean it's the truth from heaven in a sense. It means that this is very important and we need to weigh it seriously. And what they do is they can measure the effect size, the influence of something, and put a mathematical number on it. So if I've got two groups and they used to be the same, but now the light blue one has been, I've used a new strategy to teach that group and their results improve, then that difference in improvement is called the effect size. And each of these effect sizes, we can give them a numerical measure, and anything that's more than 0.4 is very powerful. So let's look at, this is an example of 4 influences on student achievement as measured by tests. Could you, let's have a quick look at these. Increasing individualized instruction, so working alone with students, giving students feedback, effective teacher collaboration, working together with teachers, or students assigning their own grades, their own marks, but the teacher gets the final say in cooperation with the teacher. Which of those, what's your top ranking? What do you think is the most powerful? Could you chat back A, B, C, or D to me and see what you think? I'm turning down to look at these coming back. Okay, we've got C, D, B, B. Anyone else going to take a stab? A lot of people are doing B first so far. So B seems to be the dominant answer right now. Okay, there are some differences of opinion. We have one person who said teacher collaboration they'd put first, but the first thing I'd like to say before I give you the answer to this is no one should be expected to know this, in the sense that this is the work of thousands of researchers working for decades. Here's the answer. This is the most powerful thing, effective teacher collaboration. And that number, 1.57, shows that this has the greatest influence. There is nothing else that has been found to have a greater influence on student learning than getting teachers to cooperate. Well, I gave away the second one. And the second one is students assigning their own grades in cooperation with teachers. How would you do that? Let me give you a quick example. Students analyze a high quality and a weak paper, if that's what the goal is, to write a paper. Teacher and students agree on the criteria. Students create a draft, plus an analysis of what mark they think it deserves. Now, they would need a scaffold to show them what an analysis looks like. Fellow student gives feedback and signs it. You provide an example of what fellow students might say. Student improves work, student hands in work and their analysis plus classmates' analysis. Incredibly demanding, probably only do it once a semester, but the number 1.33 means it supercharges learning because I take responsibility as a student. I deeply understand the criteria. I take more, we foster learner autonomy this way. So what about the last two? Does anyone want to chat what they put first? Okay, I'm seeing one person has chatted B, absolutely right. Providing feedback is really important. And increasing individualized instruction is the last one. It doesn't mean it's not important. Sometimes it will save a student, but there are many things that are much more important. So we talked about effective teacher collaboration. I'd like to look at two ways of doing that hopefully will not be too much. But before we do that, the OECD has found in its studies that teachers who were involved in collaborative learning, cooperating with other teachers, report using innovative pedagogies more and being more satisfied with their jobs. So yes, it's work, but hopefully it'll bring greater satisfaction. So here's a model that's been tried in several thousand schools and researched. It consists of focusing on formative assessment, using assessment to support learning, and it's one meeting a month for 75 minutes. The first step is deciding on what outcomes you want to achieve during the meeting. This becomes easier with the second or third meeting. Then a warm-up, something to just get you to forget about the rest of everything around you and clear your head. Then feedback on what each person has tried. So this really starts from the second meeting because every month, everybody tries something new and reports on it. Then one teacher brings some new learning. It could be a video, it could be an article they read. They report on something new. And then everyone plans how to operate it more effectively next month, 15 minutes on planning, because teachers often don't have time to plan. And then drawing conclusions. There's a model that's been used by thousands of schools. Once you get into your second meeting, that's the model that you can follow. But what about bilingual education? Well, if you're going to cooperate, you could identify needs, identifying academic language that needs to be understood and used by students, agreeing on text types students need to be able to navigate, produce. This is really important, especially for language teacher, content teacher cooperation. Identifying students who may require enrichment or remediation and deciding on how to do that. In other words, no teacher should be alone with one student trying to solve a big issue. Teachers should be working together. Agreeing on how terminology and concepts taught through the second language can be used in the first language, because we want to achieve a high degree of bilingualism in both languages. We wouldn't want students to only be able to talk about science in English, for instance, they need to be able to do it well in Spanish as well. In planning, establishing a common intended language learning outcome for the week, such as backing up your opinion with some evidence or examples. If everyone's doing that for a week or a month, you're really going to get somewhere. Deciding on a core function that teachers in one grade will all work on during a given week, like testing assumptions or building a line of argument. If every teacher is focusing on building a line of argument, a student will really get somewhere with that. Establishing common learning skills outcomes. Identifying and discussing content compatible material for use in language classes. So if I'm a language teacher and students in geography are learning through English are learning about the ice ages, maybe we will work in English class with an article or do some research on how scientists ever found out that there were ice ages. Because I could cope with that as a language teacher, and that would bring in more language, richer language into the language class. Assessment and evaluation, agreeing on how to obtain and process student feedback. Because in a bilingual program, we really need to listen to those students. We need to in a regular program as well, but especially in a bilingual program. We need to agree on how student learning of language in content classes and content learning in language classes is measured. Even if it's not for a mark in the content classes, we still need to know how we're measuring that progress, how we're supporting the progress. And then some self-reflection and professional development, sharing self-selected short video clips of parts of lessons and discussing them with a view to improving student learning. Sarah, I'm going to need to ask you to chat me the time, because what I didn't realize is both of my computers are on full screen and I literally can't see what time it is. Just tell me how much time I have left. So we're reflecting annually on how to improve teacher cooperation or making visible and celebrating achievements. We could recognize student achievements and deciding how to celebrate success. Those are just some of the topics teachers could use to discuss in cooperation when they're cooperating in bilingual education. And you really want to be cooperating between both those teaching through English and those teaching through Spanish, or you're going to find yourself in a difficult position with a school potentially developing a kind of a split, which is something absolutely to be avoided. And summarizing achievements resulting from cooperation would be important as well. And here I think school directors, principals, head teachers need to find the time in the timetable for this. So I'm coming to these again just for a moment. How important they are, because if we're trying to build autonomous learners who are good at assessing themselves, they need lots of self-assessment, they need learning skills, we need to have high expectations. As the students have said, they want clear criteria, and they need feedback, feed forward. And this is bringing us to intended outcomes. Because that's part of this picture about how to get students to think for themselves, to know where they're going, and it's important for us. Because if you don't know where you're going, how do you plan for the journey and where do you end up? And here I'm quoting, I think, the cat in Alice in Wonderland, who said, you know, you're bound to get somewhere if you walk long enough. So I'm talking about making content and language learning outcomes, which intended outcomes visible. And I'm going to bring, this brings us to CLIL, content and language integrated learning, meaning that we're trying always to integrate content and language. And quite frankly, in a student's head, you've always got at least 2 languages going. So it's integrating content and languages. But the aspect we're focusing on are outcomes. And here's an example from the third year of school of what a group of teachers who were very good teachers doing a brilliant job had come up with as their outcome initially. Does anyone notice a problem with this? All right, well, let me then say what I think is the issue. These are activities, they're not really measurable outcomes. So after some discussion with the teachers, they were really doing much more than this. And this is what they established in this bilingual program as the intended outcomes for these students. And here they are, that you'll be able to create and fill in an observation sheet about changes in the weather, create your own rain experiment, and draw conclusions from the experiment. So this is definitely more measurable, higher expectations, more meaningful. But what about the language? Now, with this group of teachers, actually, the language was just sort of incidental. They initially didn't think it through. And here is what they came up with later as language outcomes. You'll be able to group words and phrases about the weather, meaning in English, create your own word and phrase bank for speaking about the weather in English, which was the second language, and write a conclusion using a model. That's for 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, pretty, I thought really much more demanding. So CLIL calls for language outcomes in content classes. They can be about communication and language awareness, language skills, or intercultural competence. And we'll look at these more closely in a bit. So here's an example from a language class of some outcomes before the teacher moved to CLIL. You'll be able to talk about your favorite drinks. The issue here is it's an activity, it's not an outcome. Many students did not fully engage. The teacher said herself, I was having trouble getting them really to get excited about this. And there wasn't much substantive content. So the teacher tried something else. This is what she tried by bringing in more substance. You will have invented a new drink and be able to sell it to others. And well, this got the class going more. It was more engaging, and there was richer language being used. But after some discussion, the feeling was that this really still hasn't made it to CLIL, and there needs to be some really powerful, meaningful content. And here is what it came to. You'll be able to list common myths about sugary drinks and counter these myths with facts. Language, you'll build a well-structured argument. So now it's driven by content, not just vocabulary. It's more interesting, more demanding, much richer use of language. So what actually happened in the class? What did the teacher do? Well, the activities were brainstorming language needed. So the teacher put some pictures up, put an outcome up, and the students started to write individually on pieces of paper, large A4s, writing large words, what they thought was the language that was going to be necessary. That was laid out on the floor, then students organized it, added more language. That let the teacher know what they know about the topic and brought out a lot of useful language. Then the teacher surveyed student consumption very quickly. Raise your hand if you drink a sugary drink every day, and so forth. Then group work consisted of each group taking one of 7 statements each, and one was orange juice contains as much sugar as cola, true or false. They couldn't go in the internet. They had to discuss it amongst themselves. They were given a model argument about another topic, and groups had to prepare their argument. And then groups presented their arguments. Now, orange juice actually contains as much sugar as Coca-Cola, by the way. That was a bit of a shock. And everyone indicates whether the statements are true or false. And the next day, students wanted to learn more about these statements, and they were given small texts to investigate. So this ended up being a unit. So they ended up analyzing others, your own and others' consumption patterns, and drew conclusions and set targets and strategies for change when needed. So that was much, much richer. Once again, because I don't have a clock, Sarah, do chat every now and then telling me how much I have left. So outcomes. This was bilingual education. It was in Spain. Students will know the injuries caused by coal, sign and symptoms of hypothermia. Will know the assessment and treatment of a hypothermic patient and the materials related with the treatment of a hypothermic patient. That's pretty good, but it's not quite there yet, because the issue is this: how do you measure it? So let's have a look at how the teachers working on this started to think about what they really want out of the students. And this is where we got to. They got to. Students will be able to assess and treat a patient with hypothermia. This includes describing the signs and symptoms of hypothermia, listing the materials used for treating a hypothermic patient, and explaining why these materials are used, and demonstrating through role play their knowledge of the treatment of hypothermia. And language, now there's a language outcome. And this was a CLIL class, by the way, in vocational ed in Spain. Writing a clear and concise, logical step-by-step treatment for hypothermia using the correct scientific language. So the teachers afterwards themselves said they felt it was much easier to plan for that lesson. The students had a better idea of how they'd be assessed. The outcomes were, in a sense, like criteria. So let's look at what language outcomes focus on. So first, it can be on language awareness, academic versus social language, grammatical conventions. It can be on communication awareness, the richness or paucity, meaning the poor use of language. Is it a rich use or a poor use of language? Is it short answers versus long answers? Or language learning skills, how do we learn? Or intercultural communication. So an example of each would be, in language awareness, you can avoid overuse of the same adjectives, e.g. interesting. This becomes really important in a history class or any class that's being taught through a second language, also through a first language. Communication awareness, you can support your opinion with an example and with evidence. Once again, if several teachers had this at the same time, I think you would see a real change in what happens in classrooms. Language learning skills, you are able to reread your own writing for different purposes, punctuation, spelling, flow of ideas, etc. And I'm going to add one for intercultural communication, although this is a really tough topic and it's a really broad topic to discuss what is culture and intercultural competence. But for instance, you can suspend immediate judgment when analyzing situations, when reading about people from another culture. That's a real skill because it's about communication. So if we looked at these, strong or weak, can you chat back to me whether you think this one is a strong or a weak one, S or W? Let's say a content teacher sets this up as a language outcome. We've got a lot of S's coming in, so I would agree. And of course, students would need help in understanding what, how these things might be done. but structure is also part of academic language. So I think we agree here. What about this one? S or W, strong or weak? Well, the first ones come in as, oh, we got a weak, we have a strong, weak, weak. Most of them are weak. So I'm afraid I'd agree with you, because what does read and understand? I might have read it, I might not have. How will I measure this understanding? Remember all the new terminology? Okay, my problem with this one, we have a disagreement on what it is. In my opinion, it's weak because we need to know what all is. And I need to be able to do something more than remember it. To manage your own voice, maybe volume, intonation, enunciation, tone when making a presentation. Got a lot of strong coming in. I would agree. Of course, students would need criteria to know what that is, but I think that's a very strong one. And a last one, to back up your claims with examples, with details, or with evidence. Got a lot of strongs coming in, we agree. So you're not going to get time to see this, but I thought I'd leave behind something. Here are some sample language outcomes for early years. I understand this video will be available. Here are some sample outcomes for early years, language outcomes that you can use in a content class. And here are a bunch that can still be used at the upper secondary level. Not looking at them now, but you know the resource is there if you want to return to this. So ultimately, I'm trying to say, if I'm a class teacher, I would also hopefully say I teach both content and language. I'm hoping that if I'm a language teacher, I'm going to say, but I also teach content. And if I'm a history teacher, a phys ed teacher, a math teacher, a science teacher, I know my role is above all to do that, but even a little bit. But I also support language learning, but I also support language learning. I also support language learning. I think that's essential in bilingual education contexts. So my final core message really to end today is that this is where I hope you want to get to, a school where the first language and the second language, people are mixed, working together, and well-being is the focus, where teachers feel well, where students feel well, where the learning is happening. And in bilingual schools, this is what happens so often. One group separates from the other group, and that really does undermine well-being. I'm hoping that that's what you're going to focus in on, and recall that teacher cooperation is one of the most effective ways of helping students to learn. And this is something that head teachers or principals need to support. Here's a book, Killer Essentials for Secondary School Teachers, that really tries to balance lots of practical ideas and brings the research, roots it in heavily rooted in research. And here are a few other books on bilingual education. There's a guide for school principals, or if people really want to build a whole big system, there's another book. There are lots of references. You can look at those later. And I say gracias, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Special interest?
Thank you very much, Peter. We have a question from somebody from the group that's watched you regarding kindergarten bilingual development. What impact do you consider assessment tools have in early year students and kind of early education?
Well, I think what is really important is to, number one, the primary purpose of assessment is to support learning. And so even at the primary level, even in kindergarten, in preschool, it's important to begin to use, whether it's happy faces, sad faces, it's important to get into the habit of reflecting on what has happened. So for me, assessment is an essential tool to be used from preschool all the way up. The more effective we are at it, the more students learn. You know, Hattie's effect size for feedback was 0.7, but that number rises substantially when we get better at feedback, when we get better at giving students suggestions, when we get better at prompting students to think for themselves. I don't know if that answered the question though.
Yeah, I think so. I think definitely it did. Another question that I received was, how would you recommend to start incorporating more social emotional learning?
Okay, so it depends on the age group that we're talking about. So one of the ways certainly would be to talk about growth mindsets. But another way is to have students think and have a discussion, if they're older students, about what it is that they can regulate. Because, for instance, a lot of us don't necessarily, when we're young, think that you can regulate your behavior. You can regulate your, you can regulate feelings. So there are numerous things you can regulate, and that self-regulation, making students aware of what self-regulation is. So as I said, I think teaching growth mindsets, having students analyze them, with young students and even older students, getting them to learn words for emotions, because if I can't name it, I can't manage it. I would keep building that arsenal. I would do some role playing using Yale's ruler. I would use Yale's mood meter to place myself somewhere. And then talk about, really, is it a really good idea to do cooperative work when I'm in the red zone, when I've got an incredible amount of energy and I'm feeling quite unpleasant? Is that the time to cooperate? Maybe not. That's the time to let's pull back. Let's do some kind of exercise, get our brain thinking about something else.
Okay, thank you. Another question that we had was, someone would like to know how to deal with bilingualism in a context where students have different levels of English and different interests in school.
Okay. So the levels, I think, is one of the realities that is always going to be there. So certain students will need more scaffolding, more support mechanisms. The different interests is also, I think, a really key idea. I don't know how much freedom you have in Spain versus what I see in Finland or Estonia, where teachers can really decide how they are going to achieve outcomes. They have a lot of, oh, okay, you're shaking your head. Okay, that's unfortunate because one of the, for instance, one of the things Estonia does is it has replaced one examination with a student project.
Right.
And that and then the student can decide themselves what that is. So if we went into learner autonomy, if giving students some power, giving students some opportunity to decide what they will focus on and how they will get there. If you can share some power, you're more likely to get greater engagement. If you allow them to investigate something, you can perhaps offer a certain number of options and ask them, tell them they can also offer you some. And you can guide them what they're doing with that research. But if you can allow them to do some of the things they want, they're more likely to put in more time. Nobody wants to spend their life doing what somebody else is telling them to do nonstop.
That's for sure.
And if I have to go to school for 18, until I'm 18 years old, and I'm being told all the time, I'm saying, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, how am I going to think for myself when I get out? How am I going to plan my own life? How am I going to set my own goals? How am I going to become a democratic citizen? And unfortunately, the more authoritarian a school is, the more authoritarian, the research tells us, the more authoritarian a school principal is, the more authoritarian a teacher is. And I'm afraid that has a negative impact on learning, because I repeat, nobody wants to be bossed around all day long.
That's for sure. Okay, we have time for one more question, I think. And the question is, so the CBC program that we do, one of our biggest goals is to create schools where bilingual education it's actually a bilingual program, that we don't have the English department on one side and the Spanish department on the other side. What would be the first step to do that, in your opinion?
Okay, I think I'm having trouble finding one.
I know, maybe two.
So certainly, one of the mistakes we made in Estonia developing our bilingual program is if we were running an Estonian-Russian bilingual program, we trained the teachers teaching through one language more than the other. In other words, all the teachers should be getting the training. All of the teachers should be working together. Everybody in the school needs to be learning about what the research tells us about bilingual education and bilingualism and the benefits of it. There should be some joint planning. So there, I would say, Cambridge asked me that question once and asked me, Peter, could you just put down a few notes? I finished on page 129. And they took the notes and said, Peter, I think we'll publish it as a book. So, but it's together setting goals, evaluating, thinking, raising the game.
Yeah, I think a lot of schools here were created developing what we call it's often referred to as the bilingual department, which is really the English department. And that's received a lot of focus, a lot of attention. And I think that is the problem, that the idea is not, which most of your talk was about, developing the student, and then bilingual education is a part of that. It's not, we don't only focus on the language aspects or even the content aspects, but we focus on the learning of the student. So it's
absolutely, and the learning of everyone in the school. And the classic mistakes people make are giving more of the budget to the bilingual program. You have to use a fair budget. Okay, maybe this year mathematics gets a little more money, maybe next year bilingualism, but it needs to be fair. It needs to involve people. And the people teaching through Spanish need to see all of the potential benefits for them. They need to get some of those benefits. And of course, I keep coming back to the fact that bilingual education requires more from the student and the teacher. So that requires better knowledge, better teaching practices, and ultimately that leads to greater satisfaction. And I've been all over the world and had a chance to assess bilingual programs. And one question we started asking teachers when we were trying to learn how to do it well: why do you stay in this program? Everyone keeps telling us it's such hard work. I don't understand. And everywhere we went in the world, people said, because our students are learning more, we're finding it more satisfying, more intellectually challenging. But then we need to recognize everyone. We need to really see people. I know I'm stressing that word see, but it's not picking out the best teacher of the year, it's seeing everybody and recognizing their achievements. And in bilingual programs, the largest number of teachers drop out in the first 5 years all over the world. Those people need extra support, extra materials being shared. It has to be a climate where people can make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Let's learn from them.
Great. Well, we are out of time. You did an amazing job of sticking to your time limit. Thank you very much for everything that you've communicated to us. It was very interesting, and I know that people are going to come back to the video to watch it over and over again, because it's a lot of information to take in at once, but I think it's very important information for sure. So thank you very much, Peter. I'm glad that, feel free to continue to join us for as much as you'd like, and we will be in touch.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah.